No one should die carrying a secret like that. But on that cold morning in the Welsh countryside, an 82-year-old man decided he wouldn't go to his grave alone. The room smelled of medicine, old wood, and fear. It wasn't fear of death, that was in the past. It was fear of what would finally come out of his mouth. When the grandfather pulled his grandson by the arm and whispered, "There's something buried out there that should never be found," the silence that followed was heavier than any scream. It didn't sound like delirium. It sounded like a confession. You need to understand who this man was before you continue listening to this story. An ordinary grandfather, known in the village as hard-working, discreet, someone who never raised his voice, never seen arguing in public, someone who went unnoticed. Precisely the kind of person no one suspects. 50 years living in that same rural region, surrounded by hills, damp fields, and old houses where the past never truly goes away. Places like that don't forget, they just wait. While the machines beeped slowly beside the bed, he began to speak without pause, as if afraid of losing the opportunity. He said that in 1974 something happened in that land, something that was resolved the wrong way. There was no police presence, no record, no dignified burial. There was only a decision made by frightened men who believed that silence was safer than the truth. And the most disturbing thing, he didn't speak as a witness, he spoke as someone who participated. The grandson tried to interrupt, tried to rationalize, tried to say that it didn't make sense, but the grandfather squeezed his hand with a force that didn't match a body on the verge of death. He described the place with details too precise to be invented. The crooked tree near the old barn, the sound of the rain that night, the smell of the churned earth. Those who lie don't remember these things. Those who invent don't carry this weight in their voice. At this point, you might be thinking that this is just another family story, exaggerated by time, but here's the detail that changes everything. In that village, a young man disappeared exactly 50 years earlier. A case never solved. No body, no culprit, just a name that stopped being spoken aloud after some time. Coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidences don't usually reappear at the moment of death, begging to be heard. Before losing consciousness, the grandfather said something that still makes anyone who listens to this recording swallow hard. He warned that if anyone dug in that place, they wouldn't just find bones, they would find proof that more people knew, proof that the silence was a collective pact. And he left a final warning, almost a plea. If you tell this, don't trust anyone in the village. A few hours later, he died, and the secret, which should have died with him, began to breathe again. The grandson didn't sleep that night, and it wasn't because of grief. It was because every detail of the confession came back like an echo impossible to ignore. He grew up hearing stories from that village, simple, predictable stories, always the same, but now every familiar face seemed to hide something behind its eyes. The problem with hearing a secret like that is that it changes everything. The streets that once seemed tranquil now seemed too narrow. The silence, which had always been normal in that place, became suspicious. The following morning, while news of his grandfather's death spread, no one brought up the past. People offered quick condolences, avoided eye contact, and changed the subject with rehearsed ease. This kind of behavior doesn't happen by chance. Small communities learn early on to protect their own stories, especially the dirtiest ones. And when someone starts asking the wrong questions, the atmosphere changes quickly. The grandson decided to return to the old plot of land, the one his grandfather had described with such precision. It was a forgotten area, officially abandoned, but still surrounded by old fences that no one bothered to remove. The barn was still there, leaning more than before, creaking in the wind. And the crooked tree? It was there, exactly where his grandfather said. No invented memory survives 50 years with that level of accuracy. As he walked through the place, something became clear. That place hadn't just been abandoned, it had been avoided. The vegetation grew strangely, irregularly, as if the soil had been turned over many times over the decades. It didn't seem like nature following its normal course. It seemed like a constantly corrected space, as if someone wanted to ensure that nothing would come to light. It was there that he found the first concrete sign that his grandfather wasn't delirious, an old, corroded object trapped between roots exposed by erosion, a piece of metal that didn't belong in a typical rural setting. It wasn't a tool, it wasn't part of the barn, it was something personal, something someone would have tried to hide in a hurry. And at that moment, the story ceased to be an emotional confession and became a real investigation. The most disturbing thing wasn't the object itself, but the feeling of being watched. The entire community seemed too small for that kind of discovery. The grandson had the distinct impression that his presence there hadn't gone unnoticed. Closed windows, empty paths, a silence that wasn't natural, but defensive. When every community decides not to see something, it also decides who shouldn't look. And it was at that moment that he understood the true weight of his grandfather's last words. It wasn't just a buried secret, it was a silent agreement that had spanned generations, an agreement where everyone gained something in exchange for silence. And when you threaten to break that pact, you're not just unearthing a body, you're unearthing the collective guilt of an entire place. To understand what really happened, we need to go back 50 years. To a time when that village in the Welsh countryside was practically isolated from the rest of the country. In 1974, there were no cameras, no cell phones, and a man's word was worth more than any written record. People disappeared less in the newspapers, but not less in reality. And when someone disappeared there, the disappearance didn't make headlines. It became a taboo subject. The young man who disappeared back then wasn't a stranger. He was known to everyone. He occasionally worked on the farms in the region, slept wherever he could, and talked too much for a place that valued silence above all else. He asked questions, connected the dots, commented on old stories as if they were just curiosities. To outsiders, he was just an inconvenient young man. To the village, he was a risk. The grandfather was part of the group that decided to deal with that risk, not out of pure malice, but out of fear. Fear that old secrets would come to light, that small illegalities would turn into serious crimes, that reputations built over decades of coexistence would be destroyed by someone who didn't know how to put themselves in someone else's shoes. This is the kind of logic that arises in closed communities. Nobody sees themselves as a villain, only as someone protecting what is theirs. On the night it all happened, there were no screams. There was no long struggle. It was quick, confusing, and definitive. A mistake committed as a group, where each person played too small a role to bear the entire blame alone. And that's exactly why the secret survived. Collective crimes are the easiest to hide because nobody knows exactly where individual responsibility begins. The body was never seriously searched for. The local police accepted the most convenient explanation because insisting would mean investigating their own neighbors, perhaps relatives, perhaps childhood friends. The case was closed with a vague sentence, one of those that closes everything without answering anything. And over time, the disappearance became just another uncomfortable story that nobody wanted to hear to the end. The grandson now understood why his grandfather had carried this burden for half a century. It wasn't just guilt, it was the awareness that he wasn't alone that night, that if he had spoken sooner, the weight of the truth wouldn't have fallen only on him. It would have fallen on an entire village built upon a silent agreement. And when such a pact begins to crack, it doesn't break cleanly. It destroys everything around it. The problem with a secret buried for 50 years is that it never truly stays quiet. It just waits. And that same week, the grandson began to notice strange signs that his grandfather's confession hadn't been as private as it seemed. An unfamiliar car drove too slowly past the house. Someone left a gate open in the middle of the night. Small details that in isolation mean nothing, but together awaken an ancient instinct. Someone knows. The village also seemed different.
People who once greeted him naturally now looked away. Conversations ceased when he entered the pub. There were no direct accusations, no explicit threats, just a heavy, almost physical atmosphere, as if the air were denser. That's how closed communities defend themselves. They don't attack, they pressure. They make you feel like you've crossed an invisible boundary. The grandson began to revisit old records, yellowed newspapers, forgotten bulletins and public archives. And the more he searched, the more he noticed something disturbing. There were too many gaps, missed dates, contradictory testimonies that were never confronted, police reports excessively short for a disappearance. It wasn't incompetence, it was a choice. Someone decided long ago that this case shouldn't be solved. While discreetly talking to an older resident, he heard a phrase that chilled him to the bone. Some things are left in the past because the present couldn't bear to know. It didn't sound like advice, it sounded like a warning. The message was clear. Moving forward wouldn't bring justice, only consequences. And perhaps in that place, justice had never been the real objective. What disturbed the grandson most was realizing that his grandfather hadn't been a leader in the crime, but he hadn't been coerced either. He had chosen to participate. He had chosen to remain silent. And he had chosen to live an entire life pretending everything was normal while a young man remained missing, without a grave, without a name, without closure. This kind of choice doesn't age well. It rots from the inside, slowly and silently. On his last night before dying, his grandfather didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for something different, that his grandson be careful, not with his own reputation, but with the truth. Because according to him, some lies survive not because they are strong, but because nobody wants to be the first to break them. And when someone tries, the reaction is usually more violent than one might imagine.
The decision didn't come as a heroic moment, nor as an inspiring internal speech. It came in silence. That early morning when the grandson realized he wasn't sleeping well anymore, that any noise out of place made him jump out of bed, that his grandfather's secret was no longer something external, but a weight settled inside him. It was that, or except that from that day on, he would also be an accomplice. He approached the local police with extreme caution, without direct accusations, only questions. The reaction was too cold to be normal. An officer leafed through the old papers for less than a minute before closing them and returning them, saying that the case had already been reviewed enough. There was no curiosity, there was no interest, just a hasty closure. That confirmed what his grandfather had hinted at. The silence wasn't accidental, it was institutional. A few days later, someone knocked on his door at night. They didn't leave their name, didn't ask to come in, didn't threaten. They simply said, with a frightening calm, that meddling in the past usually brought unnecessary problems to people who still had a whole life ahead of them. It was a short, almost polite conversation, and precisely for that reason, terrifying. People who don't need to shout are usually certain of their own power. The grandson began recording everything. Conversations, unexpected visits, even small casual comments made by older residents when they believed they were alone. Some still carried guilt, others pride. The pattern was clear. No one spoke because everyone knew exactly what had happened. There were no conflicting versions. There was only a silent pact of self-preservation. In a forgotten archive of a regional library, he found something that shouldn't exist, a hand-scribbled map attached to a never-formalized statement. There were no names, only vague references, marked trees, an abandoned quarry, the same place his grandfather had mentioned in his confession, as if he were absolutely certain that it would never be found, because no one ever really looked for it. At that moment, the grandson understood that the 50-year-old secret had not survived out of fear of the crime, but out of fear of the consequences. If it came to light, it would not only destroy old memories, it would destroy reputations, careers, entire families. And the question ceased to be what happened and became much more dangerous. Who is still willing to protect this at any cost? The drive to the quarry was anything but cinematic. No soundtrack, no moments of inflated courage.
It was made of sweaty hands on the steering wheel, constant glances in the rearview mirror, and a persistent feeling that he wasn't alone, even though he saw no one. The place was remote, surrounded by dense vegetation and absolute silence, as if the terrain itself had learned, over decades, not to attract attention. The map in the archive wasn't precise, but it was sufficient. A collection of displaced stones, an ancient tree with deep marks on its trunk, almost swallowed by time. There, the ground seemed different, lower, as if it had been disturbed and then hastily abandoned. It wasn't his imagination. Anyone accustomed to observing would notice. The problem is that nobody wanted to observe that for 50 years. He dug little. He didn't need to insist. The earth yielded too easily, as if it had been waiting. First came remnants of fabric, then something rigid, impossible to mistake. The shock wasn't immediate. Seconds later, his mind finally accepted that this wasn't a story, nor a metaphor, nor an exaggerated confession from a dying man. It was proof, and proof doesn't disappear with silence. Before he could decide on his next step, the sound of an engine echoed in the distance. It wasn't a coincidence. It never is. He buried what he found again, not to hide it, but to buy time. He returned to his car, certain that he had crossed an invisible line, the one that separates the curious from the targets. From then on, he was no longer investigating the past. He was threatening someone's present. In the following days, small things began to change. Opened mail, deleted messages, a car repeatedly parked near his house for no apparent reason. No direct aggression, just constant reminders of surveillance. It was exactly the kind of pressure that leaves no marks, but breaks people little by little. The same method that kept that secret buried for half a century. He tried to anonymously hand over the material to a regional journalist. The response was too quick to be comfortable. They said they couldn't proceed, that the matter had already been resolved decades ago. No one solves a crime by burying it. That phrase sounded more like a warning than a professional refusal. It was then that he understood the last layer of his grandfather's secret. It wasn't just a covered-up crime, but a system that survived because it adapted, because it changed faces, because it taught new generations not to ask questions. And at that point, the choice was brutally simple. Either he exposed everything at once, or he would end up as just another name never written anywhere.
The decision didn't come as a moment of courage, but as exhaustion. Exhaustion from sleeping poorly, from answering calls with no one on the other end, from feeling that every daily step was being watched by eyes that never blink. He realized that the most common mistake in stories like this is thinking there's a safe middle ground, a way to reveal only part of the truth and get away unscathed. There isn't. Either you tell everything, or you become part of the silence. He gathered everything he had, the audio recordings secretly made in the hospital, the photos from the old archive, the maps, his grandfather's notes written in a shaky but insistent handwriting. Nothing was organized like a perfect police investigation, but it was raw, human, impossible to ignore. That's exactly how real truths present themselves. Confusing, uncomfortable, full of gaps that scream louder than ready-made answers. In the early morning hours when he decided to send the material, he didn't use names or catchy titles. He sent everything to several places at once: independent journalists, public forums, open digital archives. The logic was simple. If everyone knows, no one can erase it. His finger lingered a few seconds longer on the send button, not out of fear of what was to come, but because of the clear understanding that after this, life would never return to normal. The reaction was silent at first, the kind of silence that doesn't reassure, only prolongs. No immediate response, no confirmation. Only after hours did the first signs emerge that something had escaped control. Shared links, screenshots circulating, people connecting dots that had never been placed side by side. The secret, buried for 50 years, was breathing again. But along with the attention came the pressure. A note left on the car's windshield, unsigned. A short call, with someone saying only that not all of the past needs to be unearthed. There was no explicit threat, because clear threats generate evidence. This was more effective. It was a reminder that certain forces don't need to present themselves to be understood. He began to wonder if his grandfather knew this would happen, if the deathbed confession wasn't a plea for justice, but a transfer of burden, a man passing the weight he had carried alone for decades to someone younger, perhaps more naive, perhaps more willing to believe that the truth, by itself, changes the world. That doubt hurt more than fear. That night, reviewing everything that had been published, he noticed something no one had commented on, a detail in the documents, a name that appeared discreetly in different contexts, always far from the main focus, a name still active, still respected. And it was at that moment that it became clear. The problem wasn't what his grandfather had done or seen, but who was still alive thanks to that silence. The following morning, something changed, not in the world, not in the headlines, but in the air. He woke with the clear feeling that the time of observation was over. The material continued to circulate, being copied, reinterpreted, discussed by people who had never heard of that village in Wales, but who now felt the discomfort of realizing that old crimes don't die, they only wait. No authority appeared to confirm or deny, and this institutional silence spoke louder than any press conference. Some journalists began to distance themselves from the case as quickly as they had approached it. Others began to treat everything as historical claims difficult to verify. This type of language doesn't seek the truth, it seeks distance. When a subject becomes too uncomfortable, it is not denied, it is emptied. That's how secrets survive for decades without needing a single conscious conspirator. He returned to the quarry one last time, not to dig, but to observe. The place was different. Recent marks on the ground, discrete tapes removed, as if someone had arrived earlier and made sure to erase traces. That confirmed what he already knew. He wasn't dealing with ghosts of the past, but with real people, active, organized, protected by the collective habit of not asking too many questions. Upon returning home, he found the door unlocked. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been broken. Only one object on the kitchen table, his grandfather's original notebook, which he had kept elsewhere. Someone wanted to show that they could enter, take it, and return it. A simple, surgical gesture, impossible to denounce without seeming paranoid. This kind of message doesn't seek to frighten, it seeks to educate. On the last page of the notebook, something he didn't remember reading caught his attention. A short sentence, written with difficulty, almost illegible. Some secrets are not buried to protect the dead, but to keep the living in power. That didn't sound like regret. It sounded like a belated warning, left for whoever had the courage or misfortune to hear it. Today, if you look for this case, you'll find fragmented versions, forums discussing possibilities, videos that appear and disappear, files that no longer open. Nothing conclusive, no arrests, no acquittals, just an uncomfortable trail that insists on reappearing from time to time, as if the secret itself was testing how far silence still works. And this is where the story ends. Or begins, depending on who is listening, because now you know. And the question isn't whether it's all true, the question is another, much more uncomfortable one. If you had heard this confession in his place, would you have the courage to speak, or would you have chosen the same silence that kept this secret alive for 50 years?